Morning, folks. I would like to invite those who are going to watch the presentation to come. We have 55 slides to get through in 60 minutes. So please come and gather and get a copy of the handout from Jackie. Jackie's right there in the black coat. If we don't have enough handouts, couples can share. I think we didn't know exactly how many folks were going to be here. Yeah, Clara, sometimes in a movie theater, sitting on the front row is not the best place to be, right? Who knew? Who knew? All right. All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Father Stephen Stanley. If you don't know me, I am very honored to be here with you all this morning and to honor a significant part of the history of Trinity Ecumenical Parish's property. And I'm walking in big footsteps after Jim Morrison's presentation in February that started us off. And so this is part 2 of our presentation, and Pastor Gary will be presenting part 3 in September on the 21st at the time that we will dedicate and bless the Fieldstone gravesite, as we are calling it, and it will have a marker. And if you haven't been down there to see it, you can see some of the Fieldstones that mark that gravesite. I would like to begin us this morning with something of a disclaimer and saying that this presentation has, just one second, I lost my contact here. This presentation is a course, not a class. There is a manuscript that has over 40 pages in it that's up here. I'm not, thankfully, going to present all of it today, only selected portions of it, but we have put out a link to the full manuscript and the PowerPoint that you're going to see today, and with my email address. So please hold questions until after we're finished so I can get through all of this. And if not before church, you can email me or see me after church now. And there's a display table here for some of the source materials that have gone into this second presentation on the Llewellyn Powell family and their occupation of the Hook and then Mormon property right next door to us on 122. I would like to begin us with a prayer. Let us pray. Father, your Son said in Luke 19:40, I tell you, if my disciples are silent, these stones will shout. We come again today, Lord, to hear what some lost Fieldstones might say to us about your unseen children once denied remembrance, recognition, and human dignity, but whose names are known to you alone. These stones speak of this land and its history today, and how this land emerged from a place of bondage to a place of healing and even a place of holiness, a place that honors the God-given dignity of all humankind. May this story be our own and a legacy that we hear, remember, and share in the name of the Christ whose truth still marches on and still sets us free. Amen. Okay, onward and upward here. We began our second presentation on the history of Trinity's property with an unfamiliar word to most of us, Sankofa. Sankofa, which is also an ancient word in Africa. The concept of Sankofa is derived from the people of West Africa. And Sankofa, literally translated, means it is not taboo to go back and fetch what you forgot. In other words, visually and symbolically, Sankofa is expressed as a mythic bird that flies forward while looking backward with an egg symbolizing the future in its mouth. This Sankofa bird perfectly illustrates our purpose here. In order to understand our present and ensure our future, we must know our past. We also began with some, as all historians do, with some discoveries. History is always new. Even new information came through this morning. But we begin with the question, what is history? Before we ask, what is history for us? How do we look our history in the face and see that it is not static, that it is not just in the past, and it is still yet to be discovered, questioned, and transformed? As God lives in the past, the present, and the future, we should strive to see our history from God's point of view. So one of our most relevant questions is, what is hallowed ground? And we ask because we are dedicating a site, and you can see one of the fieldstone gravestone markers in this picture here. Have we found an 18th century plantation gravesite at Trinity? What can we learn about the unnamed people buried here? Do these unmarked graves have past and future significance? What do we do with what we have learned about these and other unmarked graves? What does it mean to belong to God in this historic place? And so we ask, what is hallowed ground? We see some examples of hallowed ground on the slide here. You probably recognize Stonehenge and the pyramids and Ground Zero. And all have been designated as hallowed ground. And so we ask, what is it? And one definition is, it is the soil in which we plant our memories and our hopes. Hallowed ground. We also ask, is our understanding of the history of this site and the land that this grave site is on, is it a microcosm of American history? I don't know how many of you know that the Hook Powell Mormon site and home right next door to us is a National Historical Landmark. How many of you know that? Okay, some know and some don't, which also means that our land, which was given to us by Dr. Mormon, was part of that historic legacy and deserves as much as the main property to be included in the National Historic Site. And so as I go through this presentation, you will see that the currents of history passed down this road we call 122, from the Revolutionary War and colonial days on to antebellum Virginia, on to the Civil War, and on to Reconstruction that followed that Civil War. Sometimes walking on sacred ground hurts to walk there, but sometimes we need to walk there. We need the strength and the sense of purpose and the knowledge of self that walking here, that is embracing our history, the parts that we like and the parts that make us uncomfortable. So I want you to be my sister and brother and walk with me through this. And in some ways it's a hard walk. And not all of the hard parts are documented here, but this is the tip of the iceberg. But if we learn to tread this ground together, there's no place we can't go. And I'm quoting author and commentator Leonard Pitts, Jr. I also want to note that this did not all come from me, that I had primary sources for my research over the last 6 months. And the conclusions that historians draw almost inevitably are provisional, because new information always comes to light. Jenny Mormon Gottlieb emailed me this morning with new information, which I did not have time. And that is emblematic of history, that it's not static, it's not just in the past. And as the old saying goes, there are 3 sides to every story: yours, mine, and the truth. Think about that. And so sacred ground is more about honoring suffering and sacrifice than it is about enshrining sainthood. But as Christians, we come at this from the perspective that we remember and God restores our memory as well as our community. I want to introduce my two primary sources, two women who are great historians and great friends of this congregation. Sherry Brown, who is with us this morning. Hold up your hand, stand up, and we will thank you. Sherry gave me this notebook to review, and it is the primary source of information in this presentation. Not all of it is in there. And this is her brand new book. Sherry is an author, The Viola Factor. I have ordered my copy. It hasn't come in yet. I hope you will order yours. It's a fascinating book and deals with the era in which we are talking about. My second source is a descendant of the Mormon family, Jenny Mormon Gottlieb in California, and she's the one that emailed me this morning and wished us well in telling the story of her family. She is a primary historian of the Mormon family and also of the Jamestown Historical Foundation. And so she is a considerable historian who is very interested in what we have discovered here. Also, New South Archaeological Associates, who looked at our site, and the Department of Interior that designated the Hook Powell Mormon site as a national landmark in '95, and also the Booker T. Washington Memorial Park Rangers and volunteers. And Marcia Melkonian is one of those volunteers, and she's with us this morning and has been very helpful. Thank you, Marcia. I just want to do a quick recap. How many of you saw Jim Morrison's presentation in February? Okay. Many of you did, and I believe there is a link to that, isn't there, Jim, or access to your presentation? Somebody has that, because I think it would. There will be. It was filmed, and so I encourage you to, when that becomes available, to see the first generations that planted on this land. This is John Hook we're talking about, who was a colonial planter, and he owned slaves here, and he founded a house here. And this Hook Plantation Farm history is that it was located in Franklin County near Hales Ford on the Lynchburg Rocky Mount Turnpike. And it was settled in 1784. And John Hook was a Scottish-born merchant who built the vernacular Georgian structure here that is preserved as his store behind the main house. The core of the present Hook Powell Mormon farmhouse was his residence. We'll see it was expanded by the Powells when they purchased the property. This is a record, and one of the rare records, and often a damaged record, of a reward poster for a runaway slave whose name was Caesar. And $25 reward was posted for the recovery of Caesar, and the text, some of it is obliterated, but down here at the bottom it says John Hook, who posted this. And Hook, as Jim told us, kept extensive ledgers of all of his properties, all of his business, and all of his slaves. And all of that record is kept in the Duke Library, and some of it is available online. The history of Franklin County is one of contrast, and probably exemplified by these two markers in Franklin County, one of which is, I'm going home to Roanoke, is the birthplace of General Jubal Early, who was a Confederate general, and his homestead has been preserved as a landmark site. And then, of course, the Booker T. Washington Memorial Park. And Booker T was born in 1856, and both preserve history, but also history has contrasting points of view as represented by Jubal Early and Booker T. Washington. But we know that John Hook's fortunes were made here in this county on his plantation with his ownership of slaves who lived, labored, and died in this place. And we don't know if Caesar was one of them, but Caesar was the only name that we've been able to recover. So the history of Franklin County is complex and exemplified by these two historical markers here. Let's see, wait a minute, push the wrong button. This is a slave map of Virginia in 1860. Census records were kept, which are accessible. And in this is Franklin County right here next to that blue dot. And the percentage of the population that were enslaved was calculated at that time. And the slave count for Franklin County was 31.8%. Some people say there were no slaves in Western Virginia. The documented evidence is that close to a third of the people who lived here in 1860 were enslaved persons. So that gives a context of some say there were no plantations and there were no slaves in Western Virginia. There certainly were fewer, as you can see the darker areas around Richmond and central Virginia there. This also includes West Virginia, which was not yet a state, separate state in 1860. So we're getting some of the cultural context here. Now, who were the Powells? And a lot of work has been done. I'm a genealogist and family historian, so this really interested me to know where people came from, you know, and also the question, why did they come here? And no history is absolute, but the historical records that I found where it had been researched said that the Powells were from Wales, and that they had a considerable estate in Wales that is still there and pictured there, the Powell Castle at Madoc, Wales. And an ancestor perhaps was Charles Powell, who was a nobleman. And there's a lot more in my manuscript about the Powell's history and genealogy. And I think it's also, we reflected on the Hook ancestry as well. And his came from Scotland. So both came from considerably influential families. There is a map which, if you can read this, yeah, I'm going to hand over the podium to you, but this is the Franklin County settlement map, which you can look at with a magnifying glass, which shows the founding families of Franklin County. And the red dot there is where we are located presently, which was in detail the John Hook and L. Powell, it says right here. So in the context of Franklin County, that's what we're talking about. And you can see how many families, settlement families there were in the settlement of Franklin County. Now, this is the first of three Powell timelines that Sherry had produced and shared with me. And timelines with the details are not always as visible on a projected screen as they are on a computer digital screen. So I apologize for that. That's about as clear as we can get it, but you can look at Jenny's book here and see more details. I just want to point out just a couple of things here, that Llewellyn Powell, as it were, was born, let's see, my pointer here, right here, 1811, August 3rd. Here's James Madison as president, and here's John Quincy Adams, and I can't even see, this is Jackson, I believe. Yeah, Andrew Jackson. So that sets in context some of the historical events, which we don't have time to cover, but this is very helpful to help us to see from 1803 to 1831. That's the period, first period we're talking about. The Powell's Rocky Mount home, as I said, is on 122. The Department of Interior did this 1995 historic place study, and they made a map that showed the buildings, and some buildings were moved from the Hook property across 122 to their present locations here. And I'm sorry this is not clear, but again, the map is available and it's also online. But the Powell's purchase of the Hales Ford property was one instance of his rising fortunes during the 1850s, a period of statewide economic growth. The 1850 census listed him as the owner of 8 slaves, a figure that grew to 20 by 1860. The value of Powell's farm was enhanced by the Rocky Mount Turnpike 122, which passed directly in front of the farmhouse on its way from the Hales Ford Bridge to the county seat in Rocky Mount. This is an actual picture, and I was amazed when she gave me her notebook. This is an actual picture of Llewellyn Powell, and I believe this picture was taken about 1863. And so you see his time frame there, and he looks like a formidable gentleman, and indeed he was. And that's his picture. And then here's his wife's picture, Elizabeth Martha Sample Powell. And there was a sample plantation over near Burnt Chimney, near Wirt's Mill. And she was the daughter of John Sample and the wife of Llewellyn Hancock Powell, and mother of children. And we were going to hear from her shortly. The Powell home and land was originally a tobacco plantation up in the Mormon era. And when Dr. Mormon had his property, Jenny told me this morning he did not want tobacco planted on his property because it was unhealthful. And he was a doctor, and tobacco plantations are very hard labor. And this is an illustration here of a tobacco plantation. And this is an early depiction or picture of the house as it once looked. It doesn't look this way anymore with a picket fence, but this is an early photo of the Powell home as it once stood. It was a very considerable estate and home. Well, Elizabeth Powell, Sample Powell, on her plantation life, and she said, quote, "I happen to be married to a man who considers it unpardonable crime for a woman to sit down and read or study. It is okay if he takes on a sheriff's job," no bitterness there, 1866 to 1868, "or goes to his Masonic Lodge meetings. On Sunday, we Welch Powells attend the Methodist Church. We sold various kinds of tobacco, bright tobacco and burley, between May and September, labor intensive. Raised horses, cattle, milk cows, hogs, sheep, and poultry. Made soup and sewed our own clothes." So she was a formidable person in herself, and I suspect even in her marriage that was probably so. That's Elizabeth. Now, to do an adequate job of a historical review, one needs to hear from all sides of the people who lived here, not just the owners, but those who were owned and those who were enslaved here. And a whole series of former slave interviews was done in the 1930s with the Federal Writers Project. And so some of these are people who are 80, 90, even over 100 years old, who remembered their life in the Civil War era, and this was recorded in the 1930s. And one of the Virginia enslaved people said the day he was to sell the children from their mother, he would tell that mother to go to some other place to do some work, and in their absence, he would sell the children. It was the same when he would sell a man's wife. He also sent him to another job, and when he returned, his wife would be gone. The master only said, "Don't worry, you can get another one." And that is a direct quote from the Writers Project. This is the hard part of history. Another slave on her faith in Jesus, and I think this is very moving. He said, Ann Bell was her name. "That's the reason I like to sing that old plantation spiritual, 'Swing low, sweet chariot, Jesus gwanter carry me home.' Does I believe in religion? What else good for colored folks? I ask you, if there ain't a heaven, what's colored folks got to look forward to? They can't get anywhere down here." This is the actual deed that Jim Morrison helped me get of the Powell's deed from the Hooks, dated 14th December 1852, and that tells you when the transfer of the property happened. And how did the Powells get this land? Before 1852, Elizabeth sold her mother's inherited plantation near Burnt Chimney. Llewellyn Powell had appraised this land for the Hook heirs. The Powells also purchased the Hook house and outbuildings, and boundaries were set and depicted on this map. You can see some of the boundaries. Again, looking at it in the notebook is clear. 1855, 1856 was the expansion of the Hook home, and it became a Greek revival style home. About $1,000 was spent on it, and the Hook outbuildings, so at least some, I guess, were moved across Highway 122. And what was the Hook store that Jim talked about became Powell's Cookhouse and slave quarters. The history team visits the Hook Powell Mormon National Landmark Site. Back in February, Jim and Rich and Gary and I were invited by Jenny Mormon Gottlieb to come and look at the property and look for grave sites. And this is a picture of the back outbuilding, which I believe is designated as the store. And perhaps later the Dr. Mormon's office, medical office. The old fireplace is still there, and there are a lot of antiques in there, fascinating stuff. And that's just a peek inside there. We have not been inside the house yet, but there's the picture of the Powell house and the outbuildings. That the one that we were just looking at is the one that's to the right of the main house there. Jenny Mormon Gottlieb's Powell research got the census of 1860, and as I said, in 1850, the Powells owned 9 slaves and a multiracial 62-year-old woman. And a decade later, there were 21. There were 2 boys, ages 3 and 1, girls ages 30, 18, 11, 4, 2, and 4, 4.5. No names or ages are given. Their slaves moved with the Powells in 1852, and we discovered that there is a fieldstone cemetery very similar to our own behind the house in the woods between our properties. And this is the site, and there were some old fencing along this area, and we found gravestones throughout here. This one that I took the picture of, they are not inscribed. They are unmarked, as most slaves were not literate or not permitted to be literate. And Jenny said in an email to me, and the Department of Interior's study said the slave cemetery on our land is in the woods behind these antebellum structures. So we don't know who all is buried on this land. We can presume, because it was a plantation and there were slaves, and slaves died on this land, that they were buried on this land because they had no other option. There may be other workers who were not enslaved, or indentured white workers, also buried on this land. So this is a second fieldstone gravesite. So there are observations and questions on the 2 sites. Both are in a wooded, secluded spot, have no visible gravestone inscriptions. Why were there 2 fieldstone burial sites on the HPM property? I haven't gotten an answer to that. Which one of them might be older? We don't know for sure. Is one from the Hook era and another from the Powell era? And are they similar to other historic fieldstone or slave burial sites? That's the work of history, to continue to ask those questions and see what evidence we can find. There is a whole history and many articles on African American burial sites and customs. I will just suffice it to say that African Americans did not bury their dead the same way that white ancestors did. There are characteristics of their grave sites and of their fieldstones, and there are hundreds of these fieldstone sites There are many in Franklin County and around the country that are being studied, like at Mount Vernon and Monticello and other places. There are at least 4 or 5 in Franklin County, and they all look similar. So the research is a correlation study looking at the characteristics of our site, even though we don't know the names, to see how they compare with what's next door and what's local and also national. I started with Jesus' quote, these stones will still will cry out, and they still cry out. These rocks, which serve as headstones, reveal a secret yet conscious coding system that the living slave community designed for their deceased. And on former plantations across the country, similar grave markers have been discovered over time, offering clues to what life and death was like for slaves in the antebellum period. This picture here is from the Booker T. Washington Sparks Cemetery that we visited with Marcia. And the stones look remarkably similar, and the configuration of them look remarkably similar. If you want to pursue this further, there's a link in the manuscript to a PBS documentary simply called Unmarked. And the thing that struck me was this quote: "They tried to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds." So I commend that. You can get that online, the Unmarked, the PBS documentary. Now, going back to the Powells in their community life, Llewellyn was an influential member of the opposition party of Franklin County, which sent delegates to the Whig Party convention in 1860, which was, of course, a very notable American election in which Abraham Lincoln was elected. The Whigs were not particularly happy about that election, and some even refused to recognize that he had been elected. Llewellyn was also an active Mason at the Rocky Mount Lodge in 1856, and you will see later that his gravestone has a Masonic symbol on it. He was a very devout member of the Masons. And he was also elected sheriff of Franklin County for a period of time, and it is said he also served as treasurer of Franklin County. So you can see that he was a formidable man in the history of Franklin County. And this is the Wingfield history, which you can get, Franklin County, Virginia history, which is a very good source to look at. This is the second Powell timeline from 1840 to 1867. And once again, the clarity of this is not ideal here, but we have, for example, the marriage of Elizabeth and Llewellyn here around 1840. And there are other events which I will not, there's Franklin Pierce, elected president during this time, and there's Lincoln's election in 1860. And again, you can look at the notebook or get the manuscript online, and you can see more of this really fascinating historical context represented on the timeline. Okay, let's see here. All right, in the Civil War now, we're moving from antebellum Virginia to Civil War. He was Captain Llewellyn Powell of the Confederate Army. He served with the Franklin County Rangers of Company D of the Virginia Confederate Army, and he was quoted as saying, "These Rangers were almost all boys. Most had makeshift weapons, and many were killed, including some of the Burroughs sons." And you may know the Booker T. Washington Memorial Park was established on the Burroughs plantation, and the Burroughs lost some of their sons in the Civil War. But they served with Captain Powell during that war. Okay. All right. Elizabeth Powell and the Yankee Raiders. The Yankees came right through here looking for food. They had food raiding parties, and they came to the Powell home demanding food. And Elizabeth was very astute. She heard the Yankees were coming. She hid her hams up in the attic, it is said. And the Yankees were going to search the house, but they went up to the attic. It was summertime. It was so hot that they didn't want to go up there. And the hams, according to this story, which may be anecdotal, was preserved. And the Yankees left, and they had ham for dinner. And so she was very enterprising in protecting her house and her food. Civil War Virginia, the history of that is written in black and white and blue and gray. There are memories of Captain Llewellyn Powell from the neighboring Holland family and their family records that talked about his activities during the war. And enslaved people, men, became soldiers on both the blue and gray side. And so the African Americans residents here served both sides in the Civil War, and served very honorably by most accountings. Now that we come to reconstructing Virginia, this is the Reconstruction era that we're now moving into after the conclusion of the war and Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. There are some historic pictures here of ruined homes and farmhouses here. This is not the Powell property, but there was a lot of devastation. Some graves were still established after the Civil War, and this is one that is unmarked. And I love this picture because there's a little flowers coming up here that kind of are a symbol of hope and rebuilding. Richmond was the most damaged area, and this is a picture of some of the devastation. So you can see that black and white suffered terribly during the Reconstruction era. And some of the hardest parts of history are still being reconciled. And during the civil rights era, some of this history that many of us did not get in school came to light. And we've learned that history is not just what we want to know, but also what we don't want to know. So we move from enslavement to emancipation, and this is important to know because of its effect on Franklin County and this place. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation did not end the Civil War, and it certainly did not reconcile the races. Emancipation did not grant equal rights or citizenship to former slaves. They were freed, but not necessarily free in the full sense of the word. In wiping away slavery, emancipation erased the very foundation of Virginia culture for both blacks and whites. It's important for us to acknowledge that devastation that happened to everybody as a result of the Civil War and the years that followed the Civil War. In 1866, there was an account of a freed woman here in Franklin County. It's a long account, and I don't have time to read it to you, but she was destitute with her children and put out of her place where she had lived as an enslaved woman and had to go door to door begging for assistance, and no one helped her. And this account is first person and emblematic in some ways of people who were slaves became sharecroppers, but they could not own property, and they did not have their own home, and they could be evicted summarily on short notice if the master or overseer came and said, "You owe us money," and they didn't have money, they were put out summarily. And so this was a very difficult time, and there was obviously a lot of resentment of the Emancipation Proclamation, particularly in this part of the country. And that history is more detailed in my manuscript. This is the Powell timeline number 3, which encompasses the latter years of the Powells from 1870 to the 1890s here. And this was some of these. This is Deputy Powell, who was a deputy sheriff, and then he became a sheriff, and he was appointed sheriff until a successor was found in 1870. Now, you can imagine being sheriff of Franklin County was never an easy job. It's probably not an easy job now, but in 1870, during Reconstruction era, imagine what it would be like to be sheriff and have to try to uphold what law there was and mediate between people's competing needs and desires. And so we have a record here, January 1st, 1875. transferred Hook Powell House to son John Robert Powell. Some of the history of this is a little bit uncertain. And then the Powells resided in Stanton, and ultimately this is the James Garfield administration, and Chester Arthur and Grover Cleveland. And this is the time of Llewellyn Powell's death, and he lost his estate here, and it was transferred to Mormons who lived on this property for a while, apparently as tenants, or rented the property until there was a final closure of the sale of the property. And you will hear more about this from Pastor Gary in his presentation, because he's going to pick up where the Mormon family took the land up until 1994, when they transferred it to Trinity Ecumenical Parish. So Reconstruction, again, was a very difficult period. It's called the Jim Crow era, and the Ku Klux Klan was there, and there were many midnight raids, and this illustration is a hard one to look at. But I put it up here. You can see a Klansman pointing a rifle at an African-American woman and her children in the middle of the night. And that was pretty normative for what was going on. But in a larger sense, Virginia was ravaged more than any other Civil War state. More battles were fought on Virginia territory than anywhere, and thus more destruction and lives were lost and ruined. Many people died during Reconstruction. Virginia became the military district #1, and freed African Americans were lynched and died by the thousands at the hands of white militia groups. And the Powells lost their slaves, their wealth, and their property. So we have to regard the fate of all who lived on this land did not always come to a good end. And this was a period in which both black and white suffered terrible consequences of what was happening in the rest of the country. And in some ways, this area was a microcosm of the Reconstruction era. Okay. All right, 1879, as best we can determine, the Powells sell 236 acres to the Mormons. And apparently there's some family relationship there. There was a family connection between the Powells and the Mormons, so they knew each other. And Llewellyn moves in with his Wright relatives in Bedford, I believe. And this is an amazing photograph that Sherry gave me. This is Llewellyn Powell in his last years, and his remaining family. This is not the house next door. This is the house where the Wright family lived. And I believe Elizabeth Powell died during this time. And so he had really no place to go except to move in with his relatives, as the Mormons rented and then purchased the Powell house and farm. And this is Llewellyn's death was in, oops, I dropped my thing, just a minute. Llewellyn's death was in 1898. And the Roanoke Times published his obituary, which we actually have. And it says Lewis, but that's probably misprint. H. Powell was an old and highly respected citizen of Bedford County who died at the home of his son-in-law, J.P. Wright of Bedford County, on Friday, February 18th, aged 87. He was born in Franklin County, where he resided for some time, was high sheriff of that county for a number of years. His remains were laid to rest in the old family burial ground beside the remains of his wife, who died several years ago. So she preceded him in death. And this is an excellent photograph. I think perhaps Sherry took this one, I don't know, but this is his gravestone. And you can see barely up there the Masonic symbol on top of his grave there. This is a picture of the Powell family cemetery fallen into disrepair. I mean, the Sample family. Okay, sorry. Has that been renovated? It hasn't. Okay, all right. And this is where Llewellyn's In the sample family. Okay, all right. I need to correct that slide. That's the sample family cemetery there. And is that in Burnt Chimney somewhere?
Right near the Shell station as you turn right on Jubal Early going to Roanoke on
Okay.
Sample Road.
Okay. All right.
As it,
Imagine, I come down from Roanoke down Windy Gap, and I'm somewhat amused by the fact that Jubal Early Highway runs into Booker T. Washington Highway right there at that intersection. I suspect there've been a lot of accidents, at that intersection where those two historic highways run into each other. But anyway, there is the cemetery. So the question in our last is, what evidence have we found? We found physical evidence of stones, of field stones that look characteristically, but not necessarily exclusively so. And we can't prove that they're only African Americans there, but they look characteristic. But we also look at the cultural and historical context of what we found down here behind the parking lot by the mule shed. And what we do know is that there were two plantations and the Mormon farm that followed on this land, and there was a tobacco barn at near the end of our parking lot when the land was transferred, which was then torn down. But nonetheless, these were typical 19th century plantation site and owners. And both families, the Hooks and the Powells, owned and we believe buried black and mulatto slaves here, as evidenced by gravestones, but probably there are a lot more graves here than just the ones we have identified. Over the years, gravestones get taken away and they get lost. And in all probability, if we found 5 or 6 gravestones, there are probably many, many more people buried right where we're sitting underneath here or out in the woods or other parts of the historic property. A few of the Powell slaves have recorded names, or the slaves have recorded names. Caesar, associated with John Hook, Eliza, the cook, and Charles and Wyatt, who were young laborers, farm laborers during the Powell era. So we can't say there are no names, but there are no names on the tombstones, but there are names in the records. And there are a lot more numbers than there are names because people counted as part of their property how many enslaved people they owned. So we have numbers, but we don't necessarily have names, and we cannot correlate those names with our particular graves, nor can they up at the Mormon property. But again, slave gravestones were typically unmarked field stones in most remote locations on the property that were untillable. Jenny Mormon Gottlieb says there is a quote unquote slave cemetery behind her property house up there, and likewise the Department of Interior names that as a slave cemetery. We're not naming ours as a slave cemetery because we don't have absolute proof of that. But by correlation, it's consistent with others that like at the Booker T. Washington site, some of their literature describes that as a slave cemetery. And so, we don't have absolute proof. We'd have to go with a shovel and a DNA kit, or ground-seeking radar to get more physical evidence. But we have historical and cultural evidence. And we affirm that slaves lived on this land. We know that. But we have no final proof of who is buried in our fieldstone gravesite. We're going to put up a marker that's going to acknowledge that people were enslaved here, but we are not naming this as a slave gravesite, but rather one to honor all the people who lived here as we honor the Mormon family in their gravesite, which Dr. Mormon asked Pastor Gary that the church maintain that as a precondition of the gift of the 13 acres that we have. So we, in fact, have 3 grave sites on this property. All should be honored and held in respect. and all of those souls belong to God, and all were made in the image of God. So, as I say, there are perhaps many more unidentified graves on the lands, on the whole property, including some of white indentured workers. There's a lot more context and evidence that we have found in the manuscript, which there's a copy of the manuscript on the table if you want to look at it after church. Also, Debbie sent out a link to it as well as to the PowerPoint here. All right. We come back to Sankofa and to say that this is a continuing reckoning. Pastor Gary continues with the Mormon and Trinity story on the 21st of September. That is the day on a Wednesday that the Fieldstone gravesite will be blessed and rededicated, hopefully with a marker. And we share in a larger national reckoning to remember, recognize, and restore lost graves and lost histories. Today we honor the history and legacy of those who owned and those who were owned on this land. We will continue to honor all the known and unknown people and families who are buried and will be buried here, particularly in our parish columbarium down there. I want to end up with Revelation 14:13. Then I heard a voice from heaven say, "Write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labor and their deeds will follow them." So there's a closing image of an unknown gravesite here, and there's still questions to be answered. And I think perhaps one of the most pertinent questions was raised by Dr. King in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? And that is a relevant question for our times. And we have choices whether we move into the future with some of the chaos of the past, or we move into the future to build a greater community among us as Americans and who are all aware of our history. So where does Trinity go from here? I believe that we affirm in doing this restoration that we stand on hallowed ground. We must revisit our past to move forward into our future. We must further engage our stewardship of this property and its continuing legacy in this community. And on that note, I want to thank the Fieldstone Committee and particularly Rich Cairns, who has given us leadership and guidance, and Al Fuzzi and Gary and all the and Smith and Gale and all who have participated in this, and Jim Morrison and the ongoing work of preserving the history of this holy place. So these stones still call on us to ask, what does it mean to belong to God in this place? We could even say this historic place. Learning about the Mormons' legacy and the gift of this holy place, which I believe, and I hope you do, that that was an act of God. That this place was transformed from a place of former bondage into a place of healing, medical healing and spiritual healing and holiness and respect for the dignity of all human beings. And so at the rededication of the gravesite, we rededicate ourselves to the work of God's healing and reconciling love. And we do this intentionally as Christian people. I want to end us with a prayer. It's Dr. King's prayer for a beloved church, community, and country. And if you can see this, please join me. Let us pray. Oh God, in these turbulent days when fear and doubt are mounting high, give us broad visions, penetrating eyes, and power of endurance. Help us to work with renewed vigor for a warless world, for a better distribution of wealth, and for a brother-sisterhood that transcends race or color. In the name and spirit of Jesus, we pray. Amen. And we're going to let Jesus have the last word here from John 8:32. And then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Thank you. Thank you.
Let me just add a word of invitation for September the 21st. If that hasn't hit you yet, that's the third Wednesday of the month. it will be a Wednesday for our midweek gathering. And instead of inviting you to gather here in the fellowship hall for potluck supper, we're going to invite you to bring a picnic supper and gather with us down under the tent in the back parking lot.
Yeah.
So pack your picnic basket and bring the things that you will enjoy. And we'll gather down there for our meal. Following the meal, I will do a briefer presentation of Dr. Mormon and the gift of land to Trinity Ecumenical Parish. I confess right now, I am not a historian, I'm not a researcher, and I do not have the gift of doing PowerPoint. But I do like to tell stories.
And you were there when it happened.
So, I will tell some stories about how we acquired this gift and then of our ongoing relationship with Dr. Mormon. And at the conclusion of that, then Pastor Philip will lead us in a service consecrating and dedicating that site on our property. So that will be your evening on September the 21st.
And I believe that either Jenny Mormon Gottlieb was tuning in to this presentation today or will tune in to the recorded version of it. So we want to thank you, Jenny Mormon Gottlieb. You have been invaluable in our history. And we are forever indebted to your family because we have this wonderful and holy place. I invite you before September 21st, if you can, to go down to the end of the parking lot here, see the split rail fence, which our Fieldstone Committee have erected down there to mark that property. I invite you to make a personal pilgrimage down there and say a prayer for all the people who lived on this land and all the people who passed it on with its history to us. And it's a significant historic place, and it's an honor for our parish to be able to acknowledge it and to make it part of our ministry. Thank you all. Yeah. Whew.